The Asia view on Trump. Analysts world over are debating and discussing what the Trump administration's likely trade policies could do to the world in coming months. There is the China view on this matter, of which we are hearing a lot, and then there is the rest of Asia, including India. Remember, not all economies are performing equally, and then there is also the currency matter, which in some ways unites Asian economies because all of them have been under pressure thanks to that ascendant dollar. I reached out to Priyanka Kishore, founder and principal economist of Singapore-based macro consultancy Asia Decoded. And I began by asking her how she was interpreting the first raft of policy moves from the Trump administration, but through an Asia lens.
Of course, markets are busy celebrating right now. We did not get any tariffs in the inauguration. But I would add a cautious tone. We have been saying for a while now that universal tariffs will hurt the US and they're likely to take a more targeted approach. And from where I sit, I see it as the administration buying some time, but not saying we will not do tariffs. So as far as, Asia is concerned, which is a more open region of the world in terms of trade, many economies are more trade oriented. I don't really think those risks have disappeared yet. We can have our CNY celebrations, but post that we will come back to these growth and tariff risks.
The other point is really the dollar, which has been going up and down, but it's been strong and now seems to have slightly eased off. And obviously, all Asian currencies have been under pressure, including the rupee, which is going through its own strategic response on whether to let it float a little bit or not. So how are you seeing the currency response, particularly across Asia?
I think I'm with you on that the dollar has given up some of its weakness overnight. It's very linked to the US policy outcomes, right? All the policies that the Trump administration are proposing, they are of broad dollar strength. Even if they say that they want a weaker currency, that's not how it works. And to that extent, I think this is a year of Asian currency weakness. In the region, we have usually had managed weaknesses. So I'm still not looking for, sharply falling knives out there. But India, I think, is an interesting one to watch out for because we've kept the currency in a de facto peg for so long. Then we have let it go now. But I still think, I'm looking for FX weaknesses between 3 to 5%, which is not that concerning in an environment of dollar strength.
What other signals are you taking away, Priyanka? Like, for example, a lot of exports into the US from Vietnam or Cambodia are originally Chinese companies. The US government has talked about, separating that, source Chinese investment versus local investment and so on. So are you seeing those as issues going onwards? And I think the larger question is, what's the framework of mind that businesses or analysts like yourselves are approaching the next few months?
I think there is a huge debate, and especially on Vietnam, as to, whether it's a beneficiary or whether it's going to bear the brunt of this administration. To my mind, I see three things. One is, of course, the direct bilateral trade balance with the US. The second is the bilateral trade balance with China, which this government is going to scrutinize pretty closely. So the origin of imports coming in, how much of those imports are actually intermediate inputs into your manufacturing versus you just rerouting finished goods from China, which is what you're referring to. And also the currency angle, right? The currency manipulator watch list. So, there are 2-3 ways they're going to come after the other countries in terms of determining tariffs. And when I put these in perspective, of course, China is there. But after China, to me, Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea, these seem to be the most vulnerable to tariff risks.
And are you seeing any trends early or projected on the geopolitical front? I mean, do you see any shifts in alliances or new blocs in this region again?
Actually, from where I am sitting and the people I'm speaking to me, there seems to be a sense of relief on the geopolitics. It does seem that, the Trump administration is considered more transactional, a word you would have heard ample number of times by now. And to that extent, maybe less interfering into, how countries conduct their geopolitical relations, the softer relations. So it does seem like, they would be less interfering when it comes to Taiwan. Also, speculations on when Taiwan going to be a negotiation tool are largely underplayed, at least here in Singapore. So geopolitically, it does seem that because this government is less focused on human rights and those kind of issues, it might actually be a better year for Asia.
And how are you seeing overall growth prospects? And within the region, are most countries in the same secular growth matrix right now? Are there big differences?
One thing you can definitely look at is who is more exposed to global slowdown, who is more exposed to a Chinese slowdown, and who is more driven by domestic growth drivers. So, India sits at a sweet spot there, despite, some consumption challenges domestically, but it's a domestic problem. It is less exposed to, what is happening in terms of tariffs or what is happening in terms of a China slowdown. Not a complete, shield there, as you could have some knock-on employment impact on the exporting industries. But if I were to rank, so it's at that end of the spectrum. On the other hand, the country where I'm sitting, Singapore, very open, very exposed to China. So it is probably one of the most downside risks. I already spoken about Vietnam. And ASEAN economy is probably somewhere in the middle. So I would say that Singapore, Vietnam, Northeast Asia in general, more exposed to downside risk. Southeast Asia in the middle, then India probably has more concerns domestically, but external-wise is better placed.
Right. And last question, if I were to just come back to currency, so are you seeing a stable dollar through the year? Or at least the foreseeable part of the year?
I think any dollar weakness will be short-lived. So in an earlier life, I was an FX strategist. And if I were to borrow from those years, I would say it's a buy on dip story for the dollar this year. Asian central banks have growth risks to contend with. So in general, I think the rate cycle is turning here, right? So it's not even like you have active rate hikes coming in to support the currency against strengthening dollar. A year of dollar strength, and that has implications for how the rate cycle will proceed, how FX results will be managed, and what will happen to currencies.
Priyanka, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.